Have you ever noticed how the ocean seems to breathe at night? How the darkness above the waves mirrors the void below until you can't tell where one begins and the other ends? I used to find that symmetry beautiful. Now it terrifies me. I'm a deep sea biologist, currently stationed aboard the research vessel Helios somewhere in the vast expanse of the Pacific. What I'm about to tell you, what happened to us out here, it shouldn't be possible. But I've learned that possible is a comforting fiction we tell ourselves to avoid facing darker truths. On paper, we're conducting a comprehensive study of the Pacific trash vortex, that massive, swirling graveyard of human waste that we've managed to create in the heart of the world's largest ocean. But the reality is far more disturbing than any environmental catastrophe. The vortex is impossibly vast. I'd seen the satellite images, read the reports, but nothing prepared me for the reality of it. Imagine an area larger than Texas, filled not just with visible debris, but with a thick, soupy suspension of microplastics that extends far deeper than our instruments can measure. The water takes on an unnatural viscosity, like blood plasma mixed with oil, refracting light in ways that make depth perception nearly impossible. But it's not just the visible pollution that's concerning. Our readings show something else. Something that makes the sophisticated equipment we brought specifically for this mission go haywire with inconsistent data. The kind of readings that make seasoned scientists double-check their calibrations and speak in whispers. The unofficial story, the one I probably shouldn't be telling you, is far more disturbing. I've spent enough time in academic research to know when there's more going on than what's in the official briefing. The way our mission parameters keep shifting. The classified sections of the ship we're not allowed to access, the strange equipment that doesn't match any oceanographic research I've ever encountered. My team has turned speculation into a kind of coping mechanism. We sit in the mess hall during our off hours, picking at freeze-dried meals and trading increasingly wild theories about what we're really doing out here. Delta, our physical oceanographer, is convinced we're searching for something ancient. He's built like a Greek statue and has the kind of mind that can visualize complex fluid dynamics in 3 dimensions. But lately he's been obsessed with patterns in our sonar readings that he says don't match any known geological formations. Echo approaches everything through the lens of chemistry and physics. She's our marine chemist, brilliant and methodical, with hands always stained with various reagents and a habit of explaining complex concepts through elaborate metaphors. Her theory involves an asteroid that she puts in air quotes, eyes gleaming with barely contained excitement as she talks about unusual mineral compositions in our deep water samples. Then there's November. Picture the kind of person who has a conspiracy theory for everything. That's November. He's our equipment specialist, and while he's brilliant with machinery, his imagination tends to run wild. He's fixated on the woman in black, a mysterious figure who joined our expedition at the last minute and spends most of her time in a restricted section of the ship. She only ever talks to Echo, November would say during our late-night card games, voice dropping to a whisper despite the constant thrum of engines. And have you noticed how she never eats with us? Never sleeps in the crew quarters? Echo would always roll her eyes at this, the fluorescent lights catching the dark circles under them that seem to grow deeper with each passing day. She's doing independent research, November. Some people just prefer to work alone. But even Echo's dismissals had started to sound hollow, especially after what we began to hear. I should have noticed something was wrong sooner. Looking back, all the signs were there, written in the subtle changes of ship life. The way the fluorescent lights in the lower decks seemed to flicker in patterns just beyond recognition. How the constant background hum of the engines would occasionally skip a beat, like a heart murmur in the ship's metal bones. It was 3 days ago when everything started to shift. I was deep in the vessel's belly, sorting through equipment in Storage Bay C, a cramped space that smelled of diesel fuel and sea salt. The metal walls were sweating condensation, creating trails that looked almost like tear tracks in the harsh overhead lighting. I was packing crates of sampling equipment into a watertight compartment when November found me. He appeared in the doorway like a ghost, his usually tanned face ashen under the fluorescence. His body blocked the exit, not threatening, but desperate, like he needed to trap someone else in his reality. What's up?" I tried to sound casual, but something about his expression made my stomach clench. November's eyes darted around the storage bay, taking in the towers of secured crates and the maze of pipes running along the ceiling. He was wearing his standard issue work coveralls, but they were wrinkled, like he'd been sleeping in them, or not sleeping at all. "Do you hear it?" His voice was barely above a whisper. I set down the pressure gauge I'd been examining and gave him my full attention. November had a reputation for crying wolf, but this felt different. His hands were trembling slightly as he gripped the doorframe, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Real fear. I made a show of listening, cocking my head to the side. The usual symphony of ship sounds surrounded us, the low thrum of engines, the creak of metal adjusting to pressure changes, the distant whir of ventilation systems. "Hear what?" "Just listen," he insisted, stepping fully into the storage bay. His boots made soft clicking sounds on the metal floor as he approached. "Really listen." I was about to dismiss him with a joke about the ship's engine when something made me pause. There was something else there, underneath the normal cacophony of vessel sounds, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but I wasn't ready to admit it yet. Wasn't ready to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, November wasn't crazy after all. "Huh," I said, affecting a thoughtful expression. "That is weird." November's face lit up with a desperate kind of hope. "You hear it too?" "Uh-huh," I nodded, then broke into a forced smile. "Sounds like a goddamn ship engine to me. What's it sound like to you?" The hope drained from his face, replaced by something harder. "You're such an asshole," he spat, turning on his heel. His footsteps echoed metallically as he stormed away, leaving me alone with the crates and pipes and something else that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. "Hey, right back at you, buddy," I called after him, but the laughter in my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. I tried to return to my work, but my hands kept fumbling with the equipment. The storage bay suddenly felt too small, too confined. The walls seemed to press in, and that sound, the one I'd denied hearing, seemed to grow stronger. It wasn't anything I could put into words, more like a presence, a weight in the air that made it harder to breathe. 2 hours later, I was heading topside when I heard it clearly for the first time, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to come from the very bowels of the ship. I froze mid-stride, my foot hovering above the next step of the metal staircase. The sound wasn't mechanical, it was too organic, too alive. It reminded me of recordings I'd heard of whale songs, but distorted, wrong somehow, like someone had taken a cetacean vocalization and played it backwards through broken speakers. My stomach growled in response. At least that's what I told myself it was. I changed course, heading for the mess hall instead of my bunk. Food would help. Food would make everything normal again. The mess hall was deserted at that hour, the industrial kitchen dark, except for the always-on safety lights. I made myself a grilled cheese sandwich, watching the cheese bubble and brown under the ancient broiler. The familiar smell of toasting bread and melting cheese helped ground me, made the whole world feel a little more solid. I doctored up some canned tomato soup with dried basil and cream from the galley stores, trying to pretend I was in a normal kitchen, not floating above thousands of feet of dark water. The soup simmered, steam rising in lazy spirals that caught the dim light. That's when I saw her. Echo was standing on the starboard deck, a solitary figure cut against the vast darkness of the Pacific night. The sodium vapor lights that lined the ship's rails cast her in sickly yellow, making her look almost spectral. Her research jacket, standard issue navy blue with reflective strips, was zipped up against the chill, but she was shivering anyway, or maybe trembling. I almost didn't approach her. There's an unspoken code on research vessels. When someone's taking a moment alone on deck at night, you leave them to it. We all need those moments sometimes, staring into the darkness, remembering there's a world beyond the confines of steel and salt. But something was off about the way she stood there, rigid as a compass needle. Her hair, usually contained in a neat braid, had come partially undone. The sea spray had frozen the loose strands into stiff spikes around her face, giving her the look of some ancient sea goddess crowned with crystalline serpents. Her cheeks were flushed despite the cold, eyes fever bright as they alternated between scanning the stars above and the waves below. The ocean was different that night. Usually, even in calm weather, there's some movement. Wavelets catching starlight, the subtle rise and fall of swells. But the water around us was wrong. Too still. Like black glass, reflecting the constellations so perfectly it was hard to tell where sea ended and sky began. It was the kind of calm that old sailors write warnings about. I stood beside her for over a minute, watching her peculiar stargazing ritual, up to Orion's belt, down to its perfect reflection, up to Cassiopeia, down to its mirror image. Each time her gaze dropped to the water, she'd lean forward slightly, as if searching for something just below the surface. "What you doing?" I finally asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Shit!" The word exploded from her like she'd been holding her breath. She spun toward me, one hand clutching the rail so hard her knuckles shone white in the deck lights. "Hey Charlie, didn't see you." Her laugh was all wrong, high and brittle like thin ice cracking. "Sorry, what did you say?" I wanted to make a joke, fall back on our usual banter, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way she kept glancing past me at the water, or how her free hand was compulsively opening and closing at her side. Instead, I just asked again, "What are you doing?" She cocked her head to the side, reminding me unnervingly of November in the storage bay. "Do you hear that?" My chest tightened. "Oh no," I said, more sharply than I intended. Real fear flashed across her face, and I saw something else there too. Recognition. "Not you too." November was going on about some noise. The tension in her face eased slightly, but the flush in her cheeks seemed to intensify. "Really?" I nodded, watching her carefully. Echo was our rock. The rational one. The one who could always explain away the strange creaks and groans of deep-sea research with scientific precision. Seeing her rattled was more disturbing than any unexplained noise. "So, you don't hear anything?" I shook my head, but even as I did, I wasn't sure it was true anymore. There was something, wasn't there? Something in the storage bay, something in the stairs, something here now, rising from the too still water. "Huh. Well," she said, though her voice suggested nothing was well at all. "I guess that makes me feel better. Maybe it's nothing. Good night." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, gave a single mechanical wave, and walked away. Her footsteps on the metal deck were too quick, too urgent for someone convinced it was nothing. I stood there for a while longer, staring out into the shadowy vastness. The stars above seemed to pulse slightly, or maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks. The water remained unnaturally still, like a vast black mirror reflecting a sky I was no longer sure I could trust. The cold finally drove me inside, but not before I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Where Echo had been gripping the rail, the metal was warped slightly, as if it had partially melted under her touch. When I ran my fingers over the deformation, the steel was ice cold. The next day began like a hangover without the benefit of having drunk anything the night before. I dragged myself out of my bunk at 0500, the fluorescent strips flickering to life with their usual artificial dawn. My dreams had been filled with strange geometries and endless reflections, leaving me more exhausted than when I'd collapsed into bed. The ship's corridor felt narrower than usual as I made my way to the lower deck, the metal walls pressing in with an almost organic pressure. Every few steps, I caught myself checking over my shoulder, convinced that the shadows behind me were moving independently of my motion. They weren't, of course. Probably. I had to deal with the tackle, hundreds of pounds of specialized deep-sea equipment that needed to be transferred from the hull compartment up to the main deck. It was the kind of mindless physical labor that usually helped clear my head. Usually. Delta was already there when I arrived, his massive frame silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting of the storage compartment. He was standing completely still, staring at the stacked crates of equipment. None of them had been moved. "Hey," he said without turning, his voice oddly flat. In the harsh shadows, his usually perfect posture seemed wrong, like his spine wasn't quite aligned the way a human spine should be. "Get some sleep?" "Some," I replied, trying to suppress a yawn that felt more like a gag reflex. The air in the compartment was thick with the smell of sea salt and something else, something metallic and organic that reminded me of blood. "You?" "None," he said, finally turning to face me. Delta was our resident Adonis, the kind of guy who looked like he'd stepped out of a fitness magazine even after weeks at sea. But now his face was gaunt, the shadows under his eyes so deep they looked like bruises. His normally warm brown skin had taken on an ashen undertone, and there was something off about the way he was breathing, too regular, too measured, like he was having to consciously remember how. "Oh shit," I said, surveying the mountain of work ahead of us. The crates seemed to loom larger than they had yesterday, their shadows stretching impossibly long across the floor. "That really sucks, man." "It was that damn noise," Delta said, still staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His eyes looked different, darker, with an oily sheen like a seal's. I told myself it was just a trick of the light. I shot him a glance, trying to keep my voice steady. "Okay, are you guys trying to fuck with me or something?" Delta's eyebrows rose slightly, the movement too smooth to be natural. "What?" I sighed, the sound echoing strangely in the confined space. "You, Echo, and November have all told me about this goddamn noise." "What noise?" "I don't hear shit." "They heard it too?" The worry that crossed his face then was all too human, breaking through whatever strangeness I'd been perceiving. He took a deep breath, a real one this time, shaky and uncertain, and said, "Just listen." So I did. The usual symphony of ship sounds surrounded us, the distant throb of engines, the creak of metal adjusting to pressure changes, the soft hiss of ventilation. But underneath it all, there was something else, something that didn't belong. At first, it was subtle, just a slight scraping against the hull, like massive fingernails being dragged lovingly across steel. The sound was almost tender in its deliberateness, and somehow that made it worse. Then came the moaning. It wasn't human, couldn't be human, but it carried too much emotion to be merely animal. It reminded me of whale song played through a broken speaker, or wind howling through impossible geometries. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, rising up through the metal deck beneath our feet and resonating in our bones. The noise modulated between frequencies that made my teeth ache and ones that stirred something primitive in my hindbrain, something that recognized a predator's call. It was impossible to tell if the sounds were expressions of agony or ecstasy, and that ambiguity was perhaps the most terrifying part. "Jesus fuck," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and insignificant against that otherworldly chorus. Delta's hand found my shoulder, his grip painfully tight. "You hear it now?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak again. The noise continued, rising and falling in patterns that almost made sense, like a language I should understand but couldn't quite grasp. We stood there in the dim light, listening to something that shouldn't exist serenade our ship with its impossible song. The crates remained untouched, our work forgotten in the face of this new, terrible reality. I wanted to run, to climb up to the sun-drenched deck and pretend none of this was happening. But some deeper instinct told me that would be worse, that whatever was out there in the darkness could sense fear and running would only make it hungrier. Everything fell apart 5 hours later. The memory of it still burns in my mind with an unnatural clarity, like images frozen in strobe lights. I jerked awake in my bunk, heart hammering against my ribs. Something, had screamed directly into my ear, the sound still echoing in my skull. But my cabin was empty, the narrow space filled only with the soft red glow of the emergency lighting and the ever-present hum of the ventilation system. My sheets were soaked with sweat, sticking to my skin like a clammy second layer. The digital clock on my wall read 2:17, its green numbers casting a sickly glow. The air felt thick, almost gelatinous, as if the humidity had solidified around me. I needed to move, to walk, to prove to myself that the world was still solid and real. I pulled on my ship-issued sweatpants and a faded t-shirt that still smelled faintly of land-based laundry detergent. The metal floor was ice-cold against my bare feet, but I welcomed the sensation. Cold meant real. Real meant safe. The wrongness hit me the moment I stepped onto the main deck. The night air should have been moving. We were in the middle of the Pacific, after all. Instead, it hung dead and still like the atmosphere in a sealed tomb. The stars above seemed too bright, too close, their reflections in the unnaturally calm water creating the vertigo-inducing illusion that we were suspended between two infinite fields of light. November and Delta were already there, both still in their sleeping clothes, their faces illuminated by the harsh deck lights. November's NASA sleep shirt was on backwards, as if he'd dressed in a panic. Delta's usually perfectly groomed hair was wild, standing up in spots like he'd been running his hands through it compulsively. They were staring at something on the starboard side, their expressions locked in a kind of horrified fascination. When they noticed me, their eyes met mine for just a moment. In that brief exchange, I saw my own terror reflected back at me. Then their gazes snapped back to whatever had commanded their attention. I followed their line of sight, and the world tilted sideways. Echo was standing on the other side of the safety railing. She was wearing the pale blue pajama set she'd bought in our last port, now soaked through with sea spray. Her feet were bare, toes curled around the outer edge of the deck, one foot already hovering over the void. Tears cut clean tracks through the salt crust on her cheeks, glinting like silver in the artificial light. "I didn't do it," she was saying, her voice cracking on each word. "I didn't say anything. I didn't tell anyone." Her hands gripped the railing behind her, knuckles white with tension. "I can't do this anymore." The words seemed to echo strangely, as if they were being spoke both forwards and backwards simultaneously. Each syllable left visible ripples in the too still air. "Don't!" The word tore from my throat before I could think. Echo turned toward me, and I almost wished she hadn't. Her eyes were wrong, the whites completely bloodshot, the irises seeming to swirl with colours that shouldn't exist. She looked at me like she was seeing something else entirely, something vast and terrible that wore my face as a mask. She shook her head, a jerky, unnatural motion, and then she let go. I screamed, we all did, and lunged for the railing. Delta was right beside me, his longer arms reaching out into empty air as if he could somehow bridge the impossible distance. The sound of Echo's body hitting the water was wrong, too solid, too final, like a door slamming shut between worlds. Then that sound rose up from beneath us, that fucking moaning. But it wasn't like before, not the distant, almost musical keen we'd heard in the storage bay. This was immediate, present, hungry. It seemed to vibrate through the hull of the ship, through our bodies, through reality itself. Echo surfaced once, her face turned upward, mouth open in a silent scream. Then something else broke the surface beside her. What emerged from the water defied everything I thought I knew about marine biology, about physics, about what should be possible in our reality. If I close my eyes now, I can still see it with perfect clarity, though my mind keeps trying to reject the memory like a transplanted organ. It rose up beside Echo like oil given form and malevolent purpose. At first, it seemed to have no fixed shape, its mass constantly flowing and reforming in patterns that hurt to look at. Imagine if you took the aurora borealis, gave it weight and terrible intelligence, then dunked it in crude oil, and you might begin to approach what we saw. The thing was vast. What breached the surface had to be just a fraction of its total mass, but even that portion dwarfed our research vessel. It moved with a liquid grace that suggested complete mastery over its form, each motion precise and deliberate, as if it was showing off for its audience. Then I saw the eye. God, that eye. It opened like an iris aperture in what might have been the creature's front, though directions lost meaning when applied to its impossible geometry. The eye was massive, easily the size of our ship's mess hall, and filled with swirling bioluminescence that shifted from abyssal green to deep purple in hypnotic patterns. The pupil was worse, a perfect circle of such absolute darkness that it seemed to absorb the deck lights, creating a void in the fabric of reality itself. That eye focused on us with an intelligence that was unmistakably alien yet terrifyingly aware. The pupil contracted slightly, adjusting to the light in a way that was almost mundane in its biological familiarity, making the whole thing even more horrifying. Echo screamed then, not a sound of fear but something deeper, more primal. She thrashed in the water, trying to swim away, but tendrils of that oil-slick mass were already wrapping around her. They moved with terrible gentleness, almost like a lover's embrace, but where they touched her body, the water began to steam despite the cold. "Help me!" she screamed, her voice distorted by whatever was happening to her. "It's not what we thought! It's not!" The rest of her words were cut off as one of those tendrils wrapped around her throat. The thing lifted her from the water, her body dangling like a puppet. In the deck lights, I could see her skin beginning to change where the creature touched her, taking on an oily sheen, becoming translucent in patches. Delta was shouting something about the rescue boat, but we all knew it was too late. The creature's mass seemed to ripple with something almost like pleasure as it began to pull Echo under. The last thing I saw was her face, eyes wide with a terrible knowledge, mouth open in a silent scream, before she disappeared beneath the surface. The water where she vanished didn't splash or ripple. Instead, it seemed to fold in on itself like paper being creased by invisible hands. The thing's eye lingered on us for one more eternal moment, its pupil dilating grotesquely as if trying to memorize our faces. Then it turned the impossible color of heat lightning and shot away into the depths, with a speed that something that size shouldn't have been capable of. The ship keeled violently to port, as if even our 312 feet of reinforced steel was nothing more than a toy in a bathtub. I lost my balance, stumbling backward into Delta, who wrapped his arms around me in what might have been protection or simply shared terror. November had collapsed to his knees, rocking slightly as he mumbled something that sounded like a prayer in a language I didn't recognize. That's when we heard the boots on deck. Oscar, our research head, running toward us with the woman in black close behind. Oscar's silver hair was disheveled, his usual composed demeanor cracking around the edges. The woman in black moved differently, each step precise, calculated, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. Oscar grabbed November by the shoulders, pulling him up from the deck with strength that belied his academic appearance. "What?" he demanded, fear making his cultured voice sharp. "For God's sake, what happened?" November's hands latched onto Oscar's arms like a drowning man clutching a life preserver. His face was wet, with tears or sea spray, I couldn't tell. "Echo," he choked out. "She jumped. And something took her." I watched Oscar's face transform as he processed this. I'd known him for years, seen him handle equipment failures, funding cuts, and near disasters at sea with unflappable calm. But now I saw real fear bleed through his professional mask. His eyes darted to the unnaturally still water, then back to us, searching for any sign that this was some sick joke. "When did this happen? What?" he started, but the woman in black cut him off. "Which way did it go?" Her voice was flat, emotionless, but her eyes were intense behind her wire-rimmed glasses. She'd pulled a device from her pocket, something that looked military, with a screen displaying patterns I didn't recognize. We all stared at her for a moment, the sudden shift in focus almost giving me whiplash. My hand was shaking as I pointed east, toward where that impossible thing had disappeared, toward land. The woman nodded once, sharp and decisive. She turned to Oscar and something passed between them, a look loaded with meaning I couldn't decipher. "Set course," she ordered, but Oscar started to protest. "She's gone, a casualty of the ocean." Her words were precise, clinical. "I'm sorry, set course." She turned to leave, her black clothing seeming to absorb the deck lights like that thing's pupil had. "Where are you going?" Oscar called after her. Without turning, she replied, "I've got to make some calls." She walked away with that same measured pace, each step exactly like the last, as if she'd rehearsed this moment countless times. The next few hours passed in a blur of incident reports and carefully worded statements. "Woman overboard in rough seas," that's what the official record would say. Never mind that the sea had been glass smooth. Never mind that 3 witnesses had seen something impossible rise from the depths. Never mind that Echo hadn't just fallen. She'd been taken. I don't know what compelled me to go to Echo's cabin. Maybe I needed proof that she'd been real, that she'd existed as more than just another terrible memory from this nightmare. The door was unlocked, strange, given her usual fastidiousness about security. The cabin was small, like all our quarters, but Echo had made it her own. Star charts covered one wall, their neat lines and familiar constellations now seeming like a cruel joke. Her desk was crowded with carefully labelled sample vials and handwritten notes. A small potted succulent, probably the only plant on the entire ship, sat in the corner, its leaves already starting to wilt without her care. Her bunk was neatly made, the corners crisp with military precision. A worn paperback copy of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea lay on the pillow, a sugar packet marking her place near the end. The absurd normality of it made my throat tight. Her clothes hung in the tiny closet, organised by type and colour. Work jumpsuits, off-duty wear, the red sweater she'd borrowed from me months ago and never returned. Everything in its place, as if she'd just stepped out for a moment and would return any second to continue her research. But there, centred on her desk like an accusation, was her journal. The leather cover was worn smooth from handling, the pages warped slightly from exposure to sea air. Most of the pages had been torn out, not randomly, but with surgical precision. The remaining pages contained only one phrase, written over and over in increasingly frantic handwriting. The abyss looks back. The abyss looks back. The abyss looks back. The last entry was different. The writing was steady again, almost too perfect, as if someone else had held the pen. It was never about the trash. The vortex is a door. We are the key. I understand now why they chose us. I'm so sorry.